Recording 53.
You will hear two students discussing a presentation they are going to give.
First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 5.
Hi, Robert.
Hi. Sorry I'm late. I was just printing off some pages about food waste in Britain.
Do you want to include Britain in the presentation? I thought we were concentrating on the USA.
Well, it is a global problem, so I thought we ought to provide some statistics that show that.
Fair enough. What did you find out?
Well, I was looking at a British study from 2013. It basically concluded that 12 billion pounds worth of food and drink was thrown away each year, all of it ending up in landfill sites. Over 8 million tons. And that wasn't including packaging.
An incredible amount.
Yes, and they were only looking at what households threw away. So there's no information about restaurants and the catering industry. But one thing the study did investigate was the amount of milk and soft drinks that were wasted. And I think it was probably quite unique in that respect.
Interesting. You know, in the other European reports I've read, there's one thing they have in common when they talk about carbon dioxide emissions.
I know what you are going to say. They never refer to the fuel that farms and factories require to produce the food, and the carbon dioxide that releases?
Exactly. We could really cut down on carbon emissions if less food was supplied in the first place. To my mind, the reports talk too much about the carbon dioxide produced by the trucks that deliver the fresh goods to the shops and take the waste away. They forget about one of the key causes of carbon dioxide.
Absolutely. If the reports are actually going to be useful to people, they need to be more comprehensive.
Who do you mean by people?
Well, the government, industries, people making television programs. Have you seen any documentaries about food waste?
Not that I remember.
My point exactly. These days, they all seem to be focusing on where your meat, fruit, and vegetables are sourced from. We're being encouraged to buy locally, not from overseas. That's probably a good thing, but I'd still like to see something about waste.
Yes, it's the same with magazine articles. It's all about fat and sugar content, and the kind of additives and coloring in food, but nothing about how it reaches your table and what happens after it ends up in the bin.
Well, we've only got 15 minutes for this presentation, so I think we'll have to limit what we say about the consequences of food waste. What do we want to concentrate on?
Well, I know some of the other presentations are looking at food and farming methods and what they do to the environment. So I think we'll avoid that. And the fact that in some countries, people can't afford the food grown on their own farms. That was covered last term.
Okay, we don't want to repeat stuff.
What concerns me above all else is that in a recession, governments should be encouraging business to find ways to cut costs. Apparently, supermarkets in the USA lose about 11% of their fruit to waste. That's throwing money away.
All right, we'll focus on that problem. It should get the others' attention anyway. Now, how do you want to begin the presentation? Let's not start with statistics, though, because that's what everybody does.
I agree. How about we give the other students a set of questions to answer about what they suspect they waste every day?
I'm fine with that. Probably a better option than showing pictures of landfill sites. It'll be more personalized that way.
All right. Now let's start.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you will have some time to look at the questions 6 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 6 to 10.
Okay, shall we now have a look at the projects that different researchers and organizations are working on?
For me, the project I really liked was the one at Tufts University. You know, where they've invented tiny edible patches to stick on fresh foods that show you what level of bacteria is present, and so whether you can still eat it.
It's a great idea, as it tells you if you need to hurry up and eat the food before it goes off. The other good thing about the patches is that apparently they'll be cheap to manufacture.
Good. Then the other thing I thought was great was the Massachusetts Institute of Technology project.
I hadn't seen that.
Well, they've developed these sensors that can detect tiny amounts of ethylene. Ethylene is the natural plant hormone in fruit that makes them turn ripe, apparently. The researchers think that they can attach the sensors to cardboard boxes, and then supermarkets can scan the sensors with a portable device to see how ripe the fruit inside is. That's got to be a quicker way to check for ripeness than taking each box off the shelf and opening it.
Definitely. And I thought that Lean Path was worth mentioning too. Their waste tracking technology means that caterers can see how much food is being wasted and why. That'll increase profits for them eventually.
Yes. And did you read about 0%? They've produced this smartphone application that allows restaurants to send donation alerts to food charities. The charities can then pick up the unwanted food and distribute it to people in need.
In the long run, that'll definitely benefit poorer families in the neighborhood. No kid should go to school hungry.
I agree. And I read that quite a few local governments in the USA are thinking about introducing compulsory composting in their states, so you can't put any food waste into your rubbish bins, just the compost bin.
Well, I guess that means a bit more work for people. I mean, they have to separate the organic and inorganic waste themselves before they take it out to the compost bin, and you know how lazy some people are. But I guess if we all start composting, we'd be doing something positive about the problem of food waste ourselves, rather than relying on the government to sort it out. Having said that, not everyone has a garden, so I guess...
That is the end of section 1. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 2. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 15.
Well, James, I've had a look over your case study, and for a first draft, it looks promising.
I have to be honest. When you told us we had to write about a furniture company, it didn't sound like the kind of thing that would interest me. But since then, I've changed my mind.
Why's that?
Well, as you know, Furniture Rossi is an Australian company, still comparatively small compared to some of the high street stores, but it's got plans to expand into foreign markets, so I chose it for that reason. It's going through a transition. It's a family-run business aiming to build a global brand.
All right, and you've made that clear in your writing. One thing, though, that I think you've overlooked is why Luca Rossi started a furniture company here in Australia in the first place.
Well, he'd just got an arts degree, hadn't he? And people were trying to talk him into an academic profession, but he wanted a practical job, something he thought would be more satisfying in the long run. His grandfather had been a craftsman, he'd made furniture in Italy, and he'd passed this skill on to Luca's father. And, well, Luca thought he'd like to continue the tradition.
Yes, that was the motivation behind his decision. And what was it, do you think, that gave Furniture Rossi a competitive edge over other furniture companies?
I wouldn't think it was price. It's always been at the higher end of the market. But according to my research, it was to do with the attitude of the employees. They were really focused on giving good customer service.
Yes, Luca Rossi insisted on that. Their promotional campaigns also emphasised the fact that the wood only came from Australian forests. But that was the case with their rivals too, so it wouldn't have made them stand out. OK, we'll have a careful look at the content of your case study in a minute, but I just want to make a general comment first before you start writing your second draft.
OK.
Yes, what I'd like to see more of is your opinion. A bit more critical thinking rather than the bare facts. But it's good to see you've been careful with your referencing this time.
Thanks. And I read and reread my work, so I'm pretty sure there aren't any errors with the language.
Yes, it's fine. Oh, but there's one other thing I could probably mention at this point.
Yes?
Well, at the end of term, you'll also be giving a presentation, also on Furniture Rossi.
Yes. I haven't given it much thought yet.
Understandably, but while you're writing the case study, I'd recommend you think about what kind of information would be suitable to use in your presentation. Remember, the last time you gave a presentation on a company, you spent a considerable part of the time providing the audience with financial data. But they probably needed to hear more about company strategy.
Yes. I did concentrate rather too much on the figures. I'll make sure there's a balance this time.
Good.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you will have some time to look at the questions 16 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 16 to 20.
OK, so let's just think about the content of your case study, the history of Furniture Rossi. I see here in paragraph 4, you're talking about how Luca Rossi raised the capital for his new business venture. And then you're talking about the customer base growing much wider. But what was it that prompted this growth?
Well, that was to do with the quality of the furniture products that the company was selling. People loved that it was all handmade and would last.
And because demand from customers kept growing?
Well, then Rossi needed to take on more craftsmen, so they could make sure the orders were ready on time. And then he also had to set up 2 new warehouses to make distribution quicker.
Yes, and from there, the company really grew. But think what happened next. they started looking at ways to increase their profits and called in a consultant. And what he saw immediately was that the infrastructure was completely outdated. They were paying 3 full-time admin staff just for data entry. So he recommended they upgrade their software programs, and that, in turn, cut operational costs and just speeded everything up.
I'm surprised they didn't get onto that earlier. But I suppose Luca Rossi was more interested in the design aspect, rather than the finance side of things.
Yes, I imagine that's why he eventually turned the day-to-day running of the company over to his son. And in fact, it was the son, Marco, who persuaded his father to move on from traditional television advertising and go online instead.
I guess that's the best way to reach people.
It can be, but initially customers actually complained.
Why?
Well, some users found it hard to navigate their way around the website, so they were getting frustrated and giving up. So then the company called in a professional to improve it.
Oh, I see. He must have done a good job. They've had a continuous 3-year rise in revenue, so things must be going well.
Indeed. And what of the future?
Well, I probably need to talk about this a bit more in the concluding paragraphs, don't I? Consumers are already aware of the quality of the furniture, that's for sure. But I think the company is aiming to publicise their values. The fact that they have respect for beauty, durability and functionality, and the environment. A lot of companies are already...
That is the end of section 2. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 3.
Recording 61.
You will hear 2 students discussing their assignments. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26.
Hi, Mike. How's it going?
Actually, I was up last night with an assignment, so yeah, I'm tired, but I guess we'd better sort this presentation out.
Well, we've done enough background reading, but I think we need to organise exactly what we're going to say about biofuels during the presentation, and the order.
I thought we could start by asking our audience what car engines were first designed to run on, fossil fuels or biofuels.
Nice idea.
Yes, when most people think about cars and fuel, they think about all the carbon dioxide that's produced, but they don't realise that that wasn't always the case.
You're probably right. The earliest car engines ran on fuel made from corn and peanut oil, didn't they?
Yes. The manufacturers used the corn and peanut oil and turned them into a kind of very pure alcohol.
You mean ethanol?
Yes. In fact, most biofuels are still based on ethanol. Actually, I've got some notes here about the process of turning plant matter into ethanol, the chemical reactions and the fermentation stages. And
it's interesting. The other students would appreciate it, but different biofuels use different processes. And if we give a general description, there's a risk we'll get it wrong, and then the tutor might mark us down. I'd rather we focus on the environmental issues.
Fair enough. So, the main plants that are used for biofuel production now are sugarcane, corn...
and canola. Of all of them, canola is probably the least harmful because machines that use it don't produce as much carbon monoxide.
Sugarcane seems to be controversial. It doesn't require as much fertilizer as corn does to grow, but when they burn the sugarcane fields, that releases loads of greenhouse gases.
Yes, but some critics have suggested that the production of corn ethanol uses up more fossil fuel energy than the biofuel energy it eventually produces. For that reason, I'd say it was more harmful to the environment.
I see what you mean. You're probably right. It's interesting how everyone saw the biofuel industry as the answer to our energy problems, but in some ways, biofuels have created new problems.
Well, in the USA, I wouldn't say that farmers are having problems. The biofuel industry, for them, has turned out to be really profitable.
I think, though, that even in the USA, ethanol is still only used as an additive to gasoline or petrol. The problem is that it still has to be transported by trucks or rail because they haven't built any pipelines to move it. Once they do, it'll be cheaper, and the industry might move forward.
That'll have to happen one day. At least the government are in favour of biofuel development.
Yes, but Brazil's probably in the lead as far as biofuels are concerned. They've got to the point where they don't need to import any oil now.
Which is great. And the industry in Brazil employs a huge number of people. But is it sustainable? I mean, as the population grows and there are more vehicles on the roads and there's more machinery, surely they can't depend so much on sugarcane. At some point, there has to be a limit on how much land can be used for sugarcane production. Certainly, if you want to preserve natural habitats and native wildlife.
I think that whatever problems Brazil's facing now, the same will be true for any country. You have to weigh up the pros and cons.
Well, we probably won't see an increase in biofuel use. I mean, they won't replace fossil fuels until we can find ways to produce them cheaply and quickly, and with less cost to the environment.
Making sure they require minimal energy to produce.
Exactly. And in a way, that means they have to cost less than fossil fuels, certainly when you're filling up your car.
Yes, and whatever other kind of engines use fossil fuels at the moment.
Now listen and answer questions 27 to 30.
All right, so in the last section of the presentation, what problems are we focusing on?
Well, we've already had a look at different types of pollution in the first section, so we can leave that out. But the biggest issue related to biofuels is that land is now being used to grow biofuel crops, and that's contributing to global hunger.
Indeed. It doesn't seem right we're using corn to run cars when people can't afford to buy it to eat. Yes, let's talk about that. The other thing is that in some countries, the way that biofuel crops are grown and harvested still produces a great deal of pollution, really damaging to the atmosphere.
OK, that's definitely an issue we should look at.
Let's not finish on a negative note, though. Why don't we talk about the potential new sources of biofuel? So rather than corn and sugarcane, what other plants could be used?
Good. Some companies are exploring the possibility of using wood and seeing how that can be used to make ethanol.
Yes, and algae is another possibility. You can grow it in any water and it absorbs pollutants too.
I read that. And grasses, they're another plant that researchers are investigating as a biofuel.
And these kind of plants aren't used as food, which is why...
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turn to section 4.
You will hear a conversation between Cressida, a student of journalism, and her tutor, Dr. Erskine, about a work placement that she has recently done.
First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Well, Cressida, that was an interesting presentation you gave yesterday on your placement at the TV News Centre.
Thank you, Dr. Erskine. I did work hard on it.
Yes, and you did entertain the class. They enjoyed your humour, but you informed them too. But I felt there was a bit of a backstory. You know, something you weren't telling us. So how was it really?
Yeah, well, I learned a lot, as I said. But I think some of the lessons weren't ones I wanted to share with the whole group. I mean, my expectations about what it would be like were too high. I'd been fantasizing a bit about what I'd be doing. I mean, it all worked out okay in the end. But I got off to a bad start.
Yes, I heard something similar from the producer, Ainsley Webb, who assessed your performance. He was quite negative about some of the things you did and your initial attitude, I'm afraid. Would you like to give me your version?
I didn't prepare properly is the main thing. On my first morning, I hadn't checked my commuting route properly. And I didn't notice that it says the buses don't start till 6. I had to run all the way to the studio, but I was still late, and I looked a mess.
Well, better at this stage of your career than later. To be honest, I made the same kind of mistakes when I was your age. But anyway, as I say, I think the presentation yesterday went extremely well, and I will bear that in mind when I grade your work experience overall.
Thank you for being so understanding.
Right. Now, have you completed your diary of what you did there? Professor Jenkins hasn't received it, he says.
Yes, I have finished it, but I wanted to just tidy it up a bit. Some of it was written in a bit of a hurry. I'll email it to him this afternoon.
OK, but I'm afraid he says this will have to be the last time you submit late. Journalism is all about deadlines, and if you can't manage them on your course, he can't give you a diploma saying you're competent, can he?
Oh, yes, I'll do it straight after this. I didn't realise.
Well, he can be a bit abrupt if he's kept waiting. It's the one thing he really doesn't like.
Ooh.
I'm sure everything is going to be fine. You're getting very good grades on your work, so as long as you remember that.
Yes.
Now, did you manage okay generally, do you think?
Yeah, okay, I think. Well, it took a while to get to grips with all the equipment. Some of it was quite old, not as fast as what we have here in college, and at first I kept thinking it was my fault. I wasn't pressing the right buttons or something. The thing was, none of the TV centre staff asked me if I wanted instructions. If I asked them how to do some particular operation, they were perfectly civil and would show me, and even say thank you for what I did do. But I felt awkward to keep asking.
Now, well, let's just review where you are, your write-up, and what you're going to include going forward to next term. First of all, did you eventually feel you were given enough to do?
The first couple of days were manic. The production team was short of staff, and I was rushing all over the building, taking messages to various people and fetching things. Of course, I didn't know my way around, so I kept ending up in some storeroom or somewhere instead of the studio I was meant to be in. Or I mistook some important visitor for a colleague because I didn't know who anyone was. Then, after that, things sort of calmed down. So sometimes I was hanging about until someone decided to give me a chore. But I had a piece of luck at the end of the week, because they got a new bit of equipment which was the same as we have in the editing suite here, and I knew how to use it, which none of them did. So that gave me a bit of status. Unfortunately, it meant I spent the next 3 days stuck in the editing suite. But by the end, I'd shown I wasn't just a silly student. So then, when the senior reporter needed someone to go out with him when he went to interview a junior minister, I got to go along, because he knew I could handle the technical side.
Well, that's good.
Yes. Well, I know I need to learn from my mistakes. I mean, basically, I need to think more about forward planning. But on the other hand, I feel much more confident now. I did survive. I didn't ruin anything. I did actually make a contribution, according to the producer. One thing I want to take forward to my final assignment, though, is some reflections on ethics.
Yes?
I had a bit of an argument with one of the senior presenters. He was editing part of an interview, and he just changed something someone said. When I questioned him, he just snubbed me. And I mean, this wasn't some public relations expert or government professional spokesperson. It was like a member of the public. But he said, oh, they never remember what they said anyway.
You want to develop this into part of your final assignment? It would be a very positive line. I can give you some references.
Oh, thanks. That would be great.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.